Good morning, good afternoon, and welcome to the Clarity Factory webinar. It's great to see you all here. I will just give it about 30 to 40 seconds before we start, just to allow a few more people to join in, but welcome and thank you for being here. So we're pleased to welcome you here this morning, this afternoon, depending on where you are in the world, for this Clarity Factory webinar, How to Measure and Communicate the Impact of Corporate Security. I spend a lot of my working days and weeks speaking with CSOs, with their teams, advising them, surveying them, interviewing them, hearing about their challenges. And I have to say that this subject matter is one that comes up in almost every conversation that I have with a corporate security team, no matter what their level of maturity, where they are in the world, or whatever sector they're working in. And I was one of the most interesting data points that we had from the CSO survey in 2025, and thank you to those of you who filled it in. One of the most interesting data points we had was that CSOs said that the biggest challenge facing their function, except from budget and resourcing, was the fact that executive leaders don't have a full and proper understanding of security. And whether or not you feel you would fit into that category, that you feel that your executive committee needs to understand better the role of corporate security and what you can add, I think most CSOs are continually asking themselves, how can I better use metrics to measure the workload and the services that we're delivering? What kind of KPIs can I use to demonstrate the effectiveness and our delivery against goals? What kind of impact calculations can we as a team adopt to show that we are reducing risk, reducing downtime, reducing cost, etc. And finally, what kind of stories and narratives can we use to really get traction within the business to help executives and key stakeholders across the organization understand who we are, why we do what we do, and how we can help them. So that's our focus for our conversation today. I'm very pleased to say that we're joined by four real experts across different aspects of that subject matter. I won't sort of share very long bios. You will have seen links to people's LinkedIn profiles and no doubt follow up afterwards. But just to give a brief introduction, Jules Parke-Robinson, who is the head of security and market safety at Philip Morris International and has held a number of senior corporate security leadership roles during her career. Jeremy Baumann, who is the CEO of Corporate Security Advisors, CSA. And a good friend and partner of the Clarity Factory. Bill Tenney, who is the CEO of AIS International, again, a partner for the Clarity Factory. Thank you for being with us, Bill. And Peter Rudge, who is the CEO and founder of HumanStory. And we'll talk a little bit more about the nature of our partnership with HumanStory as we go through the conversation today. So four incredibly helpful perspectives to help us land some of those key questions that I know you and your teams are asking yourselves on a daily basis. Finally, before we get into the meat of the conversation, just a couple of housekeeping notes here. Firstly, we're recording the webinar, so you will get a copy of this afterwards, and obviously it is therefore on the record. Secondly, if you want to ask questions, please pop them in the Q&A. Don't feel like you have to wait until the end. If I see something interesting as we go along, I may bring it in there. And certainly feel free to add questions at any point during the conversation, and we will certainly have time at the end to go through those. And just one final plug, and this will not be the last plug you hear today, is to, if you haven't already, to fill in the 2026 CSO survey. We have got a bumper crop of responses this year, but there is always room for more. So if you haven't done that, the link is in the chat and the QA. So please do that after we've finished our conversation today. So firstly, without further ado, I wanted to start actually with the basics. Because conversations about metrics and KPI and data and analytics and impact I find anyway can sometimes feel a little bit mixed up and a little bit confused. So just to set the scene before we start, I wanted to just tease out one of the key questions, which is what is the difference between metrics and KPIs? And Jules, I wonder if you could just help us understand how do you see the difference and how is that manifesting at Philip Morris International?
Absolutely. Thanks, Rachel. I think at a very basic level, obviously all KPIs are metrics, but not all metrics are KPIs. So metrics we define as measures of activity or performance. They basically tell you what is actually happening. So they can be operational, they can be tactical, and they may or may not be linked to strategic objectives. You can have lots and lots of metrics, and they're primarily used obviously for that monitoring, analysis, and a little bit of sort of diagnostic work as well. So examples that we might use would be things like the number of security incidents that have happened in a month, the average incident response time or completion to an investigation, how many sites or percentage of sites have completed emergency response drills, for example. So as they're tracked, they're really useful, but on their own, they don't define any kind of success. So the contrast to that are obviously the KPIs. So KPIs are then the critical sort of subset of metrics, and they're going to indicate whether or not you're actually achieving a specific objective. So they're going to be tied directly to a strategic or a functional objective, and they're obviously much smaller in number. They need to have a clear target, an owner, obviously, and a defined review cadence, which for us would normally be a monthly review and then maybe quarterly, depending on that particular KPI, and then an end of year performance number at the end. But more importantly, I think it's the fact that, the KPIs are what we actually use to drive decisions and accountability. So in our example, this could include things like collision rates of vehicles. It could be vendor guarding performance. It could be the number of markets meeting minimum security standards. So the KPIs are really answering the question, are we on track to achieve our objectives or not? So like many organizations, in simple terms, we use most of the metrics within the team, within the sort of the corporate security function. And they could be also things like workload, the number of assistance cases, the number of investigations. KPIs are what we tend to report outside of the corporate security function. I think the other thing that's useful to mention is that it's not always our data that supports the metrics. Sometimes we draw on data from other parts of the business. So that might include things like occupancy rates for buildings, for example, that might drive some of that as well.
And is any of your data conversely then going to other parts of the business? Just as you're sort of saying it's important that you bring in their data, how are you using your data outside of the function?
Particularly on the safety side, it sits within the sustainability space. So I think some of that is really important as well. So, you can have your metrics, you can have your KPIs, but actually if you're not sharing it with some of the other stakeholders, it's not having the impact that you actually need it to have. So we do include other stakeholders in our monthly meetings to review those to make sure they're shared. But again, on an annual basis, we would have more engagement with other stakeholders as well.
That's super helpful. And Jeremy, I'd love to sort of come to you next because obviously drawing on your career as both being a CSO and a senior security leader in a number of organizations, but also from your perch right now running corporate security advisors and working with scores of clients across different sizes, sectors, maturity levels, and so on and so forth. Are there any kind of concrete examples of metrics and KPIs that you would add in that you've seen either yourself or your clients use kind of most effectively?
Well, thank you, Rachel. Absolutely. I think the two concrete examples that I would give, one related to workplace violence prevention, and I think Jules did an absolutely fabulous job of defining the difference between metrics and KPIs. In a particular case, I would say, well, most metrics are used internal to the team, as Jules said. We found that by having open dialogue with our stakeholders, we were able to drill down and find metrics that were really valuable to the executives. And so one example of that would be one of the organizations that I led the security team at. We had a workplace violence prevention program, and we tracked workplace violence cases across 4 different case types. One of those case types was suicide and suicidal ideation as part of the program. And as we were presenting to the Human Resources Risk Committee, one of the things that we noted, it was an August presentation year to date, the number of suicide and suicidal ideation cases in that August year to date presentation had already eclipsed the previous year's full year numbers. And so as we were presenting that, the HR Risk Committee wanted to drill down into that to determine what was driving that change in the population. Was that something that was external to our company? Were there factors that were impacting our company alone? And what were we doing to be able to manage and mitigate those? Clearly the security team had a role in handling them, but the organization as a whole was trying to wrap their arms around the drivers behind those. So that became a very important metric for our team, where they were counting on the program that we built and the data that we were collecting to be able to measure that. And then we would meet as a group to be able to determine what we were doing to lower the impact of that and to lower the incidence of that, driving new programs both on the HR side and continued diligence on the reporting on the security side. KPIs, however, if I pivot to a concrete example of that becomes more, as Jules said, of a performance measurement. And so probably the most concrete example I can give is relative to the time that I spent working on product security in the pharmaceutical world. And in that case, we were measuring year over year the number of lost product in terms of dollars at wholesale acquisition cost, and measuring the cost of the program that we had implemented in order to mitigate those losses. The first year of the program, we saved about 1.4 million year over year for a program that cost a little more than about $100,000. So there we were able to demonstrate a very clear return on investment for the program that we had put in place with the goal of mitigating those losses.
That's fantastic. Really, really concrete examples. And I should imagine, the first example you gave of the sort of suicide cases and ideation cases. I should imagine in being able to provide that data, provide those insights, and work with HR, that they must have perceived you as an incredibly important partner off the back of that, given the criticality of that issue for HR. So a really good example of how actually really high quality metrics can then be part of what builds your relationship across the organization. And is there, on that point, for maybe for Jules and Jeremy, just to sort of round off some of that conversation about metrics and KPIs before we move on. In doing this, you are very practiced at doing this. And in setting up your programs, in figuring out what to measure, how to measure, who to share it with, what's appropriate for whom, et cetera, et cetera. What would you, for anyone on the call wondering, what are your key lessons learned in this space? What sort of valuable lessons would you pass on to our community about doing this and doing it effectively?
Well, I think the biggest lesson is that it's easier to in some sectors to create impactful KPIs than others. Product security is always going to be easier to demonstrate a material business impact than it is if your program is solely focused on, let's say, campus physical security, for an example. And having managed both types of programs and having different remits, it's much easier to demonstrate that on a KPI. So we always encourage our clients not to stretch with their metrics and KPIs. If you have the opportunity to develop metrics, present those to the executive committee. You don't want to be presenting the number of visitors that came into the building at the executive committee level. You're further ahead to focus on a few smaller, impactful metrics, KPIs that are very meaningful. And that really comes from understanding your business, understanding what's important to your executives, building relationships with your executives that allow you to understand on a personal level what matters to them, so that you can make sure you tailor your work to what their risk tolerance and what their beliefs are about the impact your program is having.
Yeah, I would come in on that as well. And, we at the moment report around about 10 KPIs, which is probably arguably too many. But I think, as Jeremy said, our most important one is supply chain loss rate. And really because it shows whether our security controls actually work. So it measures real product loss against shipped volume. So it really cuts through that activity and gets straight to the business impact, because every increase obviously represents a direct financial loss, insurance exposure, and then potentially operational disruption. And then it's quite often concentrated as well in highest risk markets. So unlike audits or incident counts, this KPI really does align security, supply chain and finance around a single outcome. So protecting the product, protecting the value and protecting continuity. So it has an impact to the business, which is really important.
Yeah, less is more, I guess. And we've had I was just about to remind everybody to add questions and thoughts in the chat. We're in the chat. And actually I'm pipped at the post because Jim says key is alignment with the business goals / targets, measuring value results versus activities, which I think chimes perfectly with you. And just a reminder, if you've got comments to add, if you've got questions, please pop them in the chat and I'll try and weave them in as we go along. But that sort of issue of alignment, a word that we hear a lot in our community, but actually we hear it a lot because it is absolutely critical. So we've talked a little bit about numbers and we will kind of come back to that. And obviously, as you've both reiterated, it's numbers, but it's also knowing who needs which numbers are going to really resonate with which audiences. So being sort of careful in how you choose those. But I wanted to switch tack slightly, or maybe build on that, because of course numbers are really powerful and you can't get away from using numbers within a business context, but they start to become really impactful when they're combined with the right kind of communication. And so I wanted to turn to Peter now, because you coach CEOs, entrepreneurs, politicians, and now security leaders. And of course, you have a security and diplomacy background yourself, but working with security leaders through our partnership, for which we're very grateful. And we've had a conversation many times about storytelling, what it is, how it can be powerful, and I think we both had that sense that it was something that was going to really pay dividends for this community. So I wanted to bring you in now on sort of how you marry up great data, assuming everyone's taken the wise words of Jules and Jeremy to heart. How do you really marry that up and use communication through storytelling? And maybe just again start with the basics around what is storytelling, and why can it be powerful, and then why do you think it is relevant for corporate security professionals?
Sure. A definition is quite useful, because I think it's a word, storytelling, that gets thrown around very widely, and actually it's quite a well-defined thing in the context we're talking about. It's a primal human communication system, and it's something that all human beings use to transmit and receive important data, important information. And it's a way of connecting emotional response, appropriate levels of emotional response to data. And by doing that, you have a very powerful neurochemical effect on an audience for impact, influence, trust, memorability. And really the fundamental root of it is a structural form that is common to all human beings. It's very cross-cultural. And whilst the detail of a story that you might tell about a thing that happened in the past, or a mission that you're projecting into the future, that might be culturally defined and certainly will be specific to your organization, the actual structure and format of that is absolutely universal, absolutely cross-cultural. So I think in security environment, and I come from the diplomatic service, my early career was spent there. It's absolutely key, because the roots of it is imparting survival stories to each other, how it is you get through difficult threats, protect yourself from threats, and indeed cope with threats and unexpected eventualities when they do arise. And that's the root of storytelling, the evolutionary root of storytelling. So just in the sense of giving examples of threats you've coped with, threats that you foresee in the future. If you do that in a certain structural story-based form, you will make yourself very memorable and indeed much more influential, whether you're talking to the staff of the organization or indeed your board and your management, explaining to them and making them feel what it is you do. And I think people particularly when they move from government to the commercial sector, they feel that they have to over rely on data, pure numbers to explain something. And what I would advocate for is a combination of approaches. Of course, the data really matters, but if you can just put it in this structural story form, you bring it to life for people.
Yeah, and you talk a lot in the work that we do together about how story is so critical in sort of driving trust, and sort of using story not to sort of explain what we do as a function, but more why you should trust us and what you can rely on us for. I mean, why is it so powerful as a tool for trust building in particular?
But another part of that evolutionary route of storytelling is to bind us together in groups, whether that's tribal groups, family groups, cultural groups, or organizations, where you have a shared story set, stories you all know about things that have happened in the past, challenges you've overcome together, that binds you together. It's chemical bonds of trust. And you'll all recognize that from your families, cultural groups, religious groups, military organizations. It is the stories of the things that you've done together and challenges and struggles that you've overcome together that bind you together in a neurochemical way. And that's real practical chemical trust building at work.
And that's the thing that, the worried CEO trying to make a decision at 2 a.m. in the morning about something that just happened, that's the thing they're going to fall back on, not I remember that they have a travel safety program and they have a anti-illicit trade program. They'll know they've got it. Yeah.
Storytelling done right, you project two things. You project competence and you project warmth. And if you put competence and warmth, and by warmth I mean caring, a sense of empathy for whoever it is you serve, you put those two things together and that equals trust and charisma. And absolutely right. That is what the CEO will think at 3 a.m. These guys, these people, this team have it, and I know they have it because I can feel it.
Exactly. And I'm, I don't need to be sold on this idea. I see the power of it every day, and it sort of strikes. It's always struck me that really of any place in the business that has got the potential for good storytelling and impactful storytelling, it is the corporate security function, given what you all do for a living and some of the sort of rabbits that get pulled out of hats on a daily basis for the organizations you're there to serve, the high impact stuff you do. Bill, I wonder if I could draw you in. You have this kind of really interesting vantage point because not only have you had a long and successful career in corporate security in a number of leadership roles. You're also obviously now running the world's largest security membership organization. So you have a sort of a bird's eye view into a lot of what's happening across the industry. But maybe sort of drawing on your career, or maybe what you've seen from members, how have you used storytelling within your work as a security leader? Yeah,
thanks Rachel. Look, I would say I'd maybe just double underline some of the things that the group has already talked about, and I think part of it is, like KPIs, it's tailoring those stories to business objectives and key business strategies. Those are the ones that I found really resonate the most deeply. And maybe I just use an example from my own career. Again, I'll try not to get into too much detail, but to give everyone a little bit of context, there's an example of an incentive event in Mexico. So when I was at MetLife, U.S. business, our largest business, they regularly conduct incentive events for their biggest internal and external distributors and sellers. Normally those occur within the US, and one year they decided to go to Cabo San Lucas, and not surprisingly, not talking to security about it, which this group will be very familiar with, not being consulted. And at the time, there was a dramatic increase in cartel on cartel violence within Cabo, so much so that looked a lot more like Fallujah, with bodies hanging from bridges. A little bit of panic on the part of the business. They'd already committed several $100,000 to this event. They had more payments due, and show up at security's door asking what we should do. And I think initially maybe just asking if we should just tell them no. And rather than just saying no, we basically took a partnership approach, trying to understand how important this event was to them. What had they already committed? What were they going to continue to spend? What risks were they willing to accept? What experience were they trying to create? And then really diving into them with them as a business enabler. So how do we, again, familiar to this group, how do we assess risk at a strategic level, not just what's happening in Mexico, but specifically in Cabo? How do we understand the details of the event? Where do they want to be? What are they, how much transport is required? How do we deployed some experts downrange, both from a Mexico team as well as the US. Again, this is the motherhood that this group knows well. But ultimately, we came up with a plan, and they decided, hey, this can be, and we, right on their wing, said this can be achieved. We can do this event with the right mitigation approaches, as well as backup plans and response plans. And this event was incredibly successful. The Mexico government obviously was invested in ensuring that tourism was not decreased as a result of this violence. We took precautions. It was a very successful event. The punchline was we were able to use that event to describe security as a business enabler, to reinforce that the business owns the risk, and our job is to identify and assess risk, to develop those prevention and mitigation measures, as well as help the business planfully respond from incidents. Some of that story just gets around within the business, but other ways we use that as a concrete example with other business units when they came to us with sort of similar challenges around increasing risk and key business strategies that they were trying to execute.
That's great. And so the key thing, as you said, is you were able to use that example afterwards to kind of tell the business and reinforce with the business, this is who we are, this is what we can help with, this is how we do business, this is what your capability is internally, and you can trust us. I mean, how one of the things I'm always interested in, and we sort of get a little bit of this when we run the storytelling workshops in the first sort of little part of it, is I'm always really curious as to why, for some people, the concept of storytelling they feel a little bit nervous about it. Don't want to seem to be taking advantage of a bad situation. We just need to, we get it done and we move on. Have you come across any of that nervousness, Bill? Have you felt any of that nervousness yourself?
Yeah, 100%. Yeah, look, I exemplify what you described. I mean, look, I think to Peter's point, I similarly come from that national security kind of public sector, where that is a lot of the communication in stories. And that's a lot of how sort of things get passed down. And I think when we come to business, we add that data and business piece to it. And look, sometimes we can over-index on that, thinking that it's only the data and the money and the financials, and that's going to resonate. I think that we miss something if we minimize the impact that storytelling can have. And so I would agree with you. I think sometimes security professionals do shy away from telling stories. I think we have a tendency to get the job done and move on. I do think we don't want to beat our own drum. We don't want to kind of seem to be taking advantage of some kind of bad story, because not all of these end up well. But I do think that we miss something in doing that. And I think it's the storytelling plus KPIs and metrics. It's a yes and. It's not either one. I think the data is really important. At Bloomberg, we used to say, in God we trust, all others bring data. but the storytelling makes it real for the company you're working with, because you're talking about real business units and real people, and they also can be fact checked. So if people want to kind of check your math, check your work, and say, hey, how was your experience working with these people? They've got someone that they can turn to validate, yes, this was the experience. They were a great partner. They do show up as enabler and not a group of no. And I think that can go a long way to achieving not only your program objectives, but more importantly, business objectives. How do we make sure that we're delivering security solutions to business problems? And I think stories are an important way to help us get to that point.
And I just wanted to pick up on something you said, and maybe I can turn to you, Peter, because you quite rightly said, Bill, that the sort of the default posture, I think, for many corporate security leaders is to get the job done and move on to the next challenge. And particularly given the way the world is these days, it is a very busy world for security professionals, and it's not like you get, enough time for a coffee break these days. So I just wondered, Peter, if I could bring you in on that point, because I'm always amazed when we run through this with folks, just how fast it is to get your stories in order. Could you give us a sort of a sense of, the sort of how achievable this is to kind of quickly realize what kind of stories do I need? What does my narrative need to look like? And then how do I create that story bank?
It's not as complicated as you might think, and you're not waiting for the creative muse to descend upon you, and we're not writing War and Peace here. There is a structural way to tell a story very efficiently that has neurochemical impact. It's about going through beats. Essentially, all neurochemically active stories are about people moving through challenge and then resolving that challenge, whether positively or negatively, and both can be useful types of stories. And if you hit a certain number of beats, moments of incident, moments of struggle, moments perhaps of crisis, and then transformational action to resolve crises and struggles, then you really can put together a story in 10, 15, 20 minutes and tell it in 60 seconds. So what we're not talking about is something self-indulgent. And I think that sometimes, particularly security professionals who are busy and don't want to blow their own trumpet, they feel that they're being self-indulgent by doing that. And what I would like to say is you're not. You're being very efficient, and you're being quite hard-edged also by doing it. So yeah, we're not writing novels here. We're creating little units of meaning that should be efficient and appropriate for their audience.
And I think one of the and then I'll sort of maybe move on, and we'll talk a little bit about other forms of communication. But one of the really rewarding bits of feedback that I got at an event recently, one of our sort of alumni kind of came up to me with a big smile on his face, and he said, our stories are starting to come back to us. The stories they were developing in a few minutes that took 30 seconds to tell were now doing the rounds around the business, are now coming back to the security team. So not only is it not self-indulgent, it's actually one of the most effective ways that you can. I'm not quite sure what the proportion of PowerPoint decks that sort of do the rounds of the business and end up circulating back to you are, but I suspect it may be lower. But I wanted to switch tacks now, and I wanted to maybe turn to you, if that's okay, Jeremy, because we're sort of trying to build block by block here about various different aspects of essentially demonstrating value, being able to show value, demonstrate value, and communicate value. And of course, one of the things that our data shows is that a majority of CSOs are expected to report at least annually to some kind of combination of the board, the executive committee, the C-suite, the risk committee, the audit committee. Take your pick, depending on which company you're talking about. And so this is now an absolute requirement for any CSO, any security leader. And again, I know this is something you do with and on behalf of clients and have done for many years. So could you give us maybe just sort of walk us into how do you do this effectively? And what do you have to think about in thinking about high impact presentations at that level within the business?
Yeah, absolutely, Rachel. Thank you. And I think pulling in storytelling is an important piece of that, how you communicate with leaders. And there was a comment in the chat about, the importance of storytelling and the C-suite who hardly wants to take preventative measures. I think one of the things that we really encourage is for security leaders to put themselves in the shoes of the executives that they're presenting to. If you were a group of executives, if you were to sit down and do the math and total up the salary per hour from your proxy statement in a publicly traded company, you're literally talking about thousands of dollars an hour just to get an audience with that group, sometimes more than that, tens of thousands of dollars an hour to present to that group. And they are being presented with problems that are millions of dollars in scope. And so when we present to them, we have to be mindful of the level of information that we're presenting to them and how concisely we're putting that information in front of them. We have to have a relationship with the people that we're presenting to ahead of time. We have to have taken the time to listen to them and to understand what they care about. And then as we think about the preparation for the presentation itself, you really have to be, ruthless in your focus. It takes practice. It takes confidence. You've got to be willing to tailor the message and to not use up the entire time that you have allotted. We recently presented a $101 million business plan to a client. This was for $101 million of incremental investment that they were going to make in their security program over the next 5 years. The presentation for this was actually, we were allotted 60 minutes to make this presentation. And one of my colleagues and I covered the material in 12 minutes. And we spent the next 30 minutes after that holding the discussion. Now, that's not to say that the pre-read material wasn't there. There was a 62-page narrative document that was backing this up. There was a 15-page PowerPoint that we used to cover the high spots of the presentation itself. But the amount of time that I actually spent communicating the ask to the executive committee was 12 minutes in length. And so the good rule of thumb is not to ever exceed half of the allotted time that you have with the actual presentation. Remember, the meeting should be a formality itself. You should have the outcome worked out before you ever walk into that room. You should be having one-to-ones with your stakeholders. You should be allowing for them to have input into the topic that you're presenting on. If you've got a key decision, you need to understand ahead of time where they stand on that. And I understand that there are company cultures out there who don't like the meeting before the meeting, but it's less about the meeting before the meeting, and it's more about having that relationship in place with the people that you're going to be presenting to so that you ensure success before you walk into that room. And I'll give you a very concrete example that sort of ties in the storytelling and the building of the relationship. I was recently working with a general counsel who was looking at hiring a CSO and understanding what segments of the program that they should be building within their Fortune 50 organization. And I used a story from a previous organization where, because we built a GSOC and we built the intelligence components into that GSOC, we were actually able to prevent a suicide. And I went through all the details about how it was reported to the GSOC, how the GSOC was able to develop an intelligence package, partner with external law enforcement, and how they actually were able to use us as a 24-hour call center to collect this information such that when we received the call, we were able to get local law enforcement to interact with this individual. And he was actually about to set himself on fire. He was carrying 2 cans of gasoline out to a very picturesque location to set himself on fire. Because we were able to put all these program components together, we were able to prevent this from happening. And I think the tie-in with the chat, right, is the executive in this case looked at me and said, well, but that's not material to the business. And I said that you're right, it's not. One single employee suicide is not material to the business. However, if we look at the data and we say we're going to expend all of those same resources just in the cleanup, the aftermath, the human resources, the impact on their team, the EAP, and so we're going to have equal expenditures either way, Wouldn't you prefer the outcome where we save the person's life rather than the outcome where we don't have that positive outcome and we spend all of those resources on the back end? And that was what it took to say, this isn't just money we're investing for a non-material impact. We're going to lose this either way. And so in terms of being able to use that story and couple it with data to be able to understand what was important to that particular executive that had to make a lot of big decisions and making them every day, that was really how we made the case in that instance. And I think the important thing that I learned along the way, that I had a very key leader in my development that shared with me, was be brief, be bright, and be gone. And this goes back into the 12 minutes. Go in, make your point, do it brilliantly, and then leave them the rest of the time if you've answered their questions. Don't try and use up the entire 60 minutes that you've allotted or whatever your time slot is for that presentation. They will appreciate the time back.
Be brief, be bright, and be gone. I think those are words for all of us to live by in one way or another, aren't they? I wanted to sort of build on that, because actually one of the interesting things was I asked you a question about how do you effectively go and present into a room full of busy, important, high billing colleagues. And actually what you gave us a masterclass in was all of the preparation that has to happen before you even get into the room. Yes, be bright, be brief, be bright, and be gone in the room. But actually you started by reminding us that it's all about what you've done before you've even opened the door, which I think is a really useful reminder. And I wanted to, one of the things that I think, and when I talk to CSOs, one of the things I say to them is that one of the most important things they should have within their sort of toolkit is a stakeholder map, and is a well thought through stakeholder communication and engagement plan, so that they understand who are my key interlocutors in the business, what do they care about, how are they best communicated to, etc. Jules, is this something that you've developed over your career? I might be putting you dreadfully on the spot here.
It is, but it's something that we've only done quite recently, and actually not everyone was on board with it to start with, but it's, we've developed something that actually is paying dividends. And I think I love Jeremy's 3. I would maybe have know your audience, know your subject, and less is more. And for me, knowing your audience is the stakeholder mapping bit. Without that, then who are you actually talking to and why are you talking to them? So what it's enabled us to do is really land our security narratives, shifting that conversation from this is what security does to actually what does that audience need to decide with the information that I'm giving them. So understanding really who owns what and what do they value, how do they assess success, and then how do we tailor that same security intent into that message that resonates for that particular stakeholder. So if it's a commercial leadership stakeholder, for example, it might be connected with risk and value, it might be continuity for operations, it might be governance for an assurance function. So it means that with that alignment, our story feels very relevant, it feels credible and something they can action. So it's not abstract or technical. And it's great to be able to have the meeting before the meeting, but it doesn't always have to be with that particular stakeholder. So what we've taken to doing, if we don't have the ability to get through the door until the actual meeting, is, well, who else do they engage with? Who's in their leadership team? Who are their peers? And having a conversation with them to say, I need to go and brief this particular individual about something. How do they like to receive information? We're doing actually a conversation with a key stakeholder next week. And I had a sort of pre-meeting with one of his direct reports to say, tell me about him and the way that he communicates. How does he like to receive that information and what would land best? And it was very much only ever one subject, only ever 3 slides, single topic, and gave me some really useful and tangible things for me to be able to shape that narrative, to hopefully be able to go in and have that conversation and land what it is that we need to land.
Yeah, absolutely brilliant. And a really useful kind of practical example of stuff you can do and get your team doing, to even if you can't get through to that person you need to reach, there's always somebody that can give you a perspective on how that person will best receive and respond to your message. I wanted to cover some questions about talent before we close, but I wanted to First, we do have a couple of questions in, and I would just remind others to add questions into the Q&A if you've got them. So let's look at those before we turn to talent, because it's important we bring folks in. And so we have one here from Daniel who says, going back a little bit in the conversation, I think your point there, Bill, around being consulted on business decisions is really interesting. In my experience, that really gets to the heart of how security teams are perceived in a business. Last minute requests or even requests/questions not reaching security professionals is a constant frustration of many teams. I'll maybe throw this to you, Bill. Do you have any thoughts on how we can change how our teams are perceived by the business?
Yeah, so first of all, I very much identify with Daniel's question. It's sort of tale as old as time. Security guys being brought in at the last minute. But, I think it's a little bit of, to quote Louis Pasteur, chance favors the prepared mind. How do you take advantage of those opportunities to showcase the value that security can bring? And I think to solve them long term, I think it's a ongoing journey as opposed to one and done. And I've done it multiple ways. Sometimes it's through process, where you can influence process and have security included in that. And one of my examples at MetLife was with OFAC, Overseas Foreign Advisory Controls, around anti-bribery, money laundering, things like that. We were not initially part of that process. There was an incident where, terrorists were threatening a MetLife office, and we used that incident to now include security further upstream in any OFAC designations. But some of this gets back to the topic we're talking about today around storytelling, where don't underestimate the ability of word to get around. As you support those incidents that pop up, there will be people who know each other that will say, hey, I had something that was a problem. You should call the security guys and get them engaged. So I think it's been a bit of a yes and strategy in my experience.
Yeah. That's great. Thank you. I wanted to just, we've had a question from our friend, Bruce McKindo, who says, metrics are almost always lagging indicators. The best story we can have is to link our efforts along with the other protective disciplines, bridging the silos, to increasing the certainty that the organization's value generating objectives will be met. This is what the board and C-suite are focused on. Commit investments to and know their bonuses are tied to. Thoughts? It sort of chimes with, I think, some of the stuff you were saying, Jules, about why you've chosen some of the metrics you've chosen, because they sort of do exactly what Bruce is saying. Maybe you've got some more thoughts on that.
Yeah, I completely agree, Bruce. It's a really key point. And actually, I was having a conversation earlier this morning about how do we engage with enterprise risk management, with ops risk and resilience, and with information security, because we're not a converged function, to actually bring all those things together and have one coherent message, because it's not something that we do as well as we could do yet. But I think you're absolutely right.
And this might be one for you, Jeremy, actually. Tim Rawlins, again, another good friend of the Clarity Factory. Where are you seeing the convergence with the cybersecurity teams, who generally have a vast array of stories, given the volume of security incidents, especially in recent years, to be able to demonstrate the cyber physical aspects of security? Jeremy, you're working across many different clients. How are you seeing that convergence landing? And do you think sort of thinking in those terms can help in structuring some of those kind of stories that will resonate across the company?
Yeah, and every organization takes a different view on convergence. It's been a topic for many years, and it's sort of a pendulum that swings back and forth time from time. I think the biggest area for convergence and opportunities for security leaders is really talking about that in the framework of crisis management, because we rarely have a crisis that impacts just one part of the organization. And when we have cyber impact, we have cyber vulnerabilities. There are some very concrete examples of where the risk is not just from a cyber perspective, but you'll have impact to the business based on cyber that ultimately leads to a physical security problem. So using those stories to be able to talk about crisis management that has impacts Actually, the GSOC that we built at one of the organizations I led the security team at, we actually positioned the crisis room right in between the cyber GSOC and the physical security GSOC, because most of the organization's risk was actually to the cyber infrastructure. So anytime we were having a people issue, a impact to facilities, there was a cyber nexus to that. And so educating the executives on how one particular incident has the potential to impact both domains, I think, is really using that storytelling to pull in why they need to take a converged look at risk. It doesn't always mean that the organizations need to report to each other, but they need to be working well together to ensure that there aren't gaps. Again, another example to use storytelling to highlight risks, highlight how a physical security vulnerability can lead to a cybersecurity risk in support of getting your programs funded the way they need to, helping the executives understand a material risk. That's really where that pulls in for me.
That's great. And a absolutely shameless plug for our report last year, Holistic Security, which talked about and presented a maturity model for precisely, as you've said, Jeremy, those organizations that for whatever reason can't, won't, don't want to converge, which is the majority, about 85% of big multinationals are not currently converged. But we put together a maturity framework for those who aren't, to help them build partnerships despite not reporting to the same boss, not sharing the same budget, et cetera, et cetera. So it is absolutely doable without that particular organizational structure. A couple of things I would add as well as a sort of a sort of a connected tangent to that is two trends that I'm kind of being asked about more and more seeing. One is CSOs telling me in increasing numbers that they are being brought in to help their organization think about how it responds to critical IT outage. I think we're seeing a lot more of that across corporations, so really critical role for corporate security there. And I'm also starting to see more of an emphasis within job descriptions and recruitment and so on and so forth around operational resilience skill sets and roles within the security function. So others on the call, I'm sure, will be much more steeped in those kind of issues than I will. But a couple of trends that I'm seeing. It's a nice segue into just maybe looking briefly at the issue of talent, which is a sort of a firm favorite subject of mine, because we can talk the talk, but we can't really walk the walk unless we have the right people in the roles with the right technology, with many other things as well. But I just wanted to talk briefly about kind of competencies and capabilities. I mean, are we skilled up to do this? I mean, Bill, what's your take on this? You have a really great bird's eye view across the industry.
Yeah, look, the good news at ASIS, we deliver out a lot of content. The bad news is we deliver a lot of content. So how do we focus on that for the security professional? And I do think two of the areas we focus on are really around training and education for individuals, but also standards and best practices for teams and organizations. And I think this very much dovetails with the question on cyber. As we look at what security is becoming and has already become, how do we ensure that we're creating those adaptive, multi-capable, future forward-looking people in our workforce? What are the competencies they need? What are the capabilities that they need? And some time ago, ASIS developed a enterprise security risk management competency model, and we've actually created a task force to use that as sort of a jumping off point to kind of to improve this. And I think I would underline Jeremy's comment around the cyber corporate security space. I don't say physical, because with my internal partners that evokes gates, guards, and guns, and corporate security is so much broader than that. And we have stepped into these areas around intelligence, around resilience, around supply chain security, around threats in the workplace, around executive protection, et cetera. And so how do we make sure that we are creating the workforce that is capable of addressing that and communicating across silos, much as Bruce described? And so we are working on that. We are neck deep in that. We've got a task force, not only including ASIS members, but some of the folks on this call, including yourself, Rachel, including Bruce, including folks who are CSOs. So we're neck deep in this and continuing to work on it.
That's great, very important. And as just a comment in from Jim Murphy again, security's role in leading/facilitating a company's executive crisis management team is a prime opportunity to drive collaboration across the organizations. Jeremy's comments are spot on. I mean, Peter, we've sort of run through storytelling skill training workshops with I'm not quite sure how many security professionals now. Its number is growing fast by the day. I'm always surprised how quickly people take to the skill set and sort of walk out of that workshop actually doing a pretty good job. Do you think this is a community that's well placed to sort of develop this skill set and put it to use?
Everything would echo that. Everything I've seen so far from people in the profession, they are extraordinary at it, and it doesn't take them long to. This is already hardwired into their minds because they're human beings. But the things they're dealing with are absolutely custom made for the development of good, effective, efficient little stories. And I think we see that whenever we work with them. They come out and they are, it's the thing I love most about doing that is hearing some of their stories, and they are absolute crackers.
Yeah, and just finally to you, Jeremy, because I know within your business you are sort of helping companies with recruitment, so you're kind of probably seeing more resumes on a daily basis and understanding what clients want to see than probably anyone on our panel. And so, do you think security leaders are yet bringing in the right talent to be competent on data, metrics, analytics, KPIs, communication? Do we know what we're looking for, and did we find it yet?
I still think there's a lot of opportunity in that. As security leaders look at their organizations, we encourage them to resist the urge to bring on another security generalist or another security technologist. When you look at how to get to the heart of those metrics, when you look at developing those KPIs, do you have a business analyst on your team? Do you have, when you think about how to communicate security's message to the organization, we at CSA, we talk about you have really two jobs. One is to make your people safe. The other is to make sure that they feel safe. And if you're not doing the full job, you're leaving half of your job undone. You're a manager of security communications has been a position that has been key to the organizations I've built, many of the leaders on our team, and it's one of the things we look at. How do we tell those stories, but how do we communicate all of the things that we need folks to know from a security perspective? It's the number one thing that we can do to move the needle on making our workforce feel safe. And yet it's one of the fewest positions that we see on a security team when we go out and we do an organizational evaluation. A training specialist, right? If we want our teams to be competent in things, do we have a dedicated role for that? And I think because we're so often under-resourced, we don't necessarily understand how to make the business case for those positions. We might have an incorrect gut feeling that they're frivolous, those type of roles. And so we spend a lot of time working with organizations to show them how to tell the story, how to build the business case for those positions being absolutely critical to their mission. And that's what leads to unlocking the potential that your ability to impact the organization has.
Absolutely, absolutely. Well, listen, this has just been an absolutely fantastic conversation. I would like to thank everybody for joining. I'd like to thank the speakers for giving their time and their expertise, and I'm sure we've all gone away with many nuggets of things we can go do differently in the office tomorrow. I also want to thank the sponsors of the 2026 CSO survey from the Clarity Factory, who are Ontic, ASIS International, CSA, Factal, Cirrus, and Dataminer. They make all of this possible, so thank you very much to those organisations. Thanks to the Clarity Factory team. The CSO survey, there is a link that has been circulating several times in the chat. If you haven't had a chance to complete it yet, please do. You've only got a couple of weeks to do it. It closes on 30th of April. I've keep having a sneak peek in. The numbers are looking really good. So we've got a great data set this year, but the bigger we go, the more reliable the data, the richer the data. So please take 10 minutes, it's confidential. And we will also be releasing the data in September entirely free of charge. So it's a fantastic resource for you and your teams. Please do stay in touch. This is a critical issue for our industry. It's going to be something we're focusing on in our 2026 CSO survey report this year. So if you've got examples you'd like to share anonymously, if you'd like to take part in an interview for the survey this year, if you'd like to share some of what you've done, please reach out. We'd love to hear from you. And please do stay in touch with the Clarity Factory. You can follow us via our newsletter, and the link is in the comments. So thank you very much for your time. Thanks so much. Thanks for joining us.